Hello, and welcome to Family Matters, a joint production of the Bowen Center for the Study of the Family and the University of the District of Columbia. I'm Dr. Mariana Martinez, your host. When a person presents symptoms that affect reproduction, such as problems with, say, ovulation, fertility, or endometriosis, one rarely thinks of looking into relationships with family as they search for understanding these problems. Our guest today will help us see the profound connection between health symptoms, relationships, and stress. Is there in fact a way of using family system psychotherapy to give, as Dr. Bowen used to say, nature a better chance? Our topic today is Bowen Theory with symptoms that impact reproduction. Joining me again is Ms. Victoria Harrison. Ms. Harrison began to study Bowen Theory in 1976 with an interest in symptoms related to health and physical illness. For several decades, she has practiced family system psychotherapy using biofeedback and neurofeedback, and she has specifically focused her clinical work, as well as her research, on symptoms that impact reproduction. She has written several articles about the interaction of reactivity, family relationships, and development and treatment of endometriosis. Ms. Harrison, welcome back to Family Matters.
Thank you. Thank you.
So tell me about the connection between these symptoms in reproduction and family systems and family psychotherapy. It sounds like a long stretch at first glance.
Well, you would probably know how often reproductive symptoms show up in a broad average clinical practice. If you begin to gather history of a family or of a person, often infertility treatment, fertility treatment, PMS, menopause symptoms, sexual problems, problems with miscarriage, problems with pregnancy, are part of the history of many families. And I became intrigued with the project of understanding what was known about how the human reactivity to stress, for example, or to relationships could impact reproduction and reproductive symptoms. So in 1980, I launched off in the direction of studying with reproductive endocrinologists in Texas who were generous with their time and who would answer my million questions about where to look in the literature to find out how our fight or flight response, for example, could impact PMS or our hormones. And I began to spend all of my waking time looking for dots to connect and literature that connected the dots on the one hand, while at the same time I was seeing people in clinical practice that gave me opportunities to ask them questions and to begin to see the ways that they were overcoming some of these kinds of symptoms while involved in Bowen family system psychotherapy.
So tell me one example or a case that might exemplify this process.
Well, could I back up?
Yes,
and
you may.
Say that I had the advantage of learning Bowen family systems theory at a time when the Bowen Center was part of the Georgetown University Medical School. And Murray Bowen had introduced the use of biofeedback instruments as part of learning about reactivity to relationships. And so I was able to use these instruments to look at some of the physical reactions to stress and stabilizing reactions that people would experience while they were talking about their family and family history. So I was able to begin to use those instruments to study stress reactivity.
So you had already made the connection between the stress, the physical symptoms or physical
Reactions.
Yeah, I didn't want to use the same word, but there we go.
How many times? Count it, 5 times maybe.
So the physical reaction to stress, to demands in the environment, to relationships, that the connection was there. Now from there to connecting that to difficulties in reproduction, how did you do that?
Well, I grew up on a farm, for one thing, and I knew that if my mare was stressed during the fall and winter, she could go a season without conceiving and foaling. I knew that my young dog's level of stress when she jumped out of a car and had a major injury affected her pregnancy later in that year. I knew that there were connections between how animals reacted to life and the conditions of life and their reproductive system. And I thought, surely there are studies that would describe the same thing for human reproduction. And when I began to look in the literature, I found that indeed there was not nearly as much known about how our nervous system reactions, our muscle tension reactions, and our hormones as well are affected by what we are experiencing. Our relationships with each other. In the natural world, every other form of life, reproduction is affected by the relationships between males and females and between generations of kin. And I began to think about how to understand the human family and reproduction within that same broad framework, and have been working on it ever since.
So when somebody comes to your office and says, Ms. Harrison, I have reproduction difficulties, I have gone through infertility, or I have problems with ovulation, or whatever they present,
Right.
Where does your head go?
To the history of the family, and to asking a survey of the family system with an emphasis on contact and reactivity between family members and the presence of circumstances that would promote anxiety or stress reactions for the woman. If I can give you an example, often people come to see me when they are in fertility treatment. Fertility treatment itself, of course, is stressful. But prior to the focus on reproduction or fertility treatment, often a woman or a couple have experienced circumstances and situations that would be demanding, stressful, and require their resources for managing. So someone would be on the biofeedback equipment, neurofeedback, both, while talking to me about their own family history, and then the history of their efforts to conceive. And while doing so, they could see, and I could see, on the neurofeedback, biofeedback computer screen, the examples of physiology that can interrupt and affect reproduction itself. Fight or flight response, muscle tension, increased adrenaline. Those are just some of the ways that our body is built to respond to the demands of life that set up reactions that compete with LHFSH, for example, or estrogen and progesterone production. With that knowledge, then I would begin coaching a woman or a couple to begin observing some of the ways of reacting that would be associated with carrying a level of stress and reactivity to stress that can interrupt or compete with reproduction.
What would be the difference between what you do, which is psychotherapy based on Bowen Theory, to deal with this type of difficulties, and just regular, relaxing practices such as yoga or meditation or going to the gym, or there's so many, eating well, etc.
I often recommend that people do use mindfulness or meditation or yoga or exercise to interrupt and decrease the level of anxiety or tension they are experiencing. But what I've found is that for a high percentage of people, those efforts alone will not modify the reactivity that's stirred when they're in the environment interacting with a husband or their mother or their mother and father or an earlier child. One example would be a woman that I will be seeing next week who has recognized that she puts everyone else on the list higher than she puts taking care of herself. She puts taking care of her mother and her father who've recently divorced, attending to her husband and meeting his needs, and cooperating with the needs of a 2-year-old, heaven forbid. The stress reactivity that she carries is high and constant. And the symptoms that she experiences are associated with a more constant level of stress on the clock, minute to minute, than to a temporary or an acute and immediate temporary reaction to tension. So she
never turns off
she
the
never
system.
takes time out to restore, recover, or interrupt that tension, and to restore and recover her own energy and equanimity, take care of herself. So she is, and her symptoms are migraines, endometriosis, polycystic ovaries, many reproductive and health symptoms that are associated with a more than short-term level of stress and reaction to stress. She is in a family that has been terrifically stressed by deaths over the last 3 or 4 years in the family. So she's going to be working on ways to recognize how quickly she steps in to take on the problems of others as her own, and taking time out to learn how to leave those problems with those to whom they belong, and to work on restoring her own stability and energy and equanimity.
And you believe,
which will do enough.
So those type of changes to lower the level of stress that she is carrying with the 24 hours a day would eventually, in your thinking, translate into less symptoms, into the going back to health? Is that?
I wish I could. The papers that I've written on this subject are mostly single case family examples. And I wish that there were 150 examples or 300 examples. It's been my observation that many variables play a part in human reproduction, that someone who's motivated can observe and modify a percentage of those, but none of us understand the nature at play as well as necessary to overcome them. And I suspect that we will not ever overcome.
But you sound pretty convinced.
The forces of nature 100%.
Right, but you sound pretty convinced that working on self and handling relationships in the family in a better way eventually could translate into a better health in general.
What I've observed, and over 30 years now in clinical practice, often with symptoms that impact fertility or reproduction, is that as someone works on understanding the family they're part of in a more factual, objective way, recognizing their own reactions and reaction patterns, and changing those, that people do give nature a better chance. sex, as Bowen said, they will be healthier, they will function better within the constraints and the forces of nature at play. At the same time, I don't think anyone understands the ways in which the human family and each of us is responding to our natural environment and the social environment and relationships to regulate health and reproduction. Nobody understands that well enough, except perhaps Mother Nature.
And she hasn't written her book yet.
And Mother Nature is regulating reproduction. In nature, no one species, let me see how to put this. In nature, everyone does not reproduce in the natural world.
Correct.
If every individual in a species or a form of life reproduced, we would overrun our small planet. Nature is regulating reproduction in response to resources and stresses. I believe the better we could understand that, either in our own family or for the human family, the better we could guide ourselves, and the less we would experience suffering in the face of natural processes.
Now, how do you understand situations that don't seem that extreme? For example, a 15 or 14-year-old girl who lives in a family with all the regular, ups and downs of family life, that all of a sudden starts having symptoms related to reproduction at an early age, and she's ready to go to high school or college or whatever, and she can do that because of these symptoms.
Right.
And there doesn't seem to be one stressor, like somebody dying, or how do you understand something like that happening?
Looking at the family as a system that's larger than mother and father and siblings, looking at the family as a system that includes siblings, aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents, siblings and descendants, is a framework for understanding the reactivity, the stress reactions that are stirred, and symptoms that may occur around adolescence or any other period of time in life. There is some fascinating research. For example, that, I'm not going to remember the name of the scientist who has done this, Hieronymus, Dr. Hieronymus, has observed that women whose mothers and grandmothers lived short, troubled lives will begin menstruation and sexual activity at an earlier age than their cohorts. That a 12-year-old whose mother and grandmother lived short, challenged lives is more likely to begin menstruation, fertility, and reproduction at an earlier age.
Are you saying that what happens to me is not independent of what happened to others in my family and in other generations, even if I didn't know them?
That's right. That we are part of a multi-generational family history and heritage that has an influence over our biology, our brains, our behavior, and our own lives. And that the more someone can put themselves in that perspective, the more someone can know the history that is influencing their own reactivity and relationships, the better we can guide and manage that reactivity itself.
So how much wiggle, room is there? If this is multi-generational, it comes from not only the way I behave and the way I take care of myself, but it's also connected to others. Like, what can I do with myself if I'm in the middle of a problem, in this case, a reproduction, symptom related to reproduction? Is there anything I can do as an individual without having to go to my grandmother and have her changed, and go to my aunt and have her changed?
Well, Dr. Martinez, the focus on changing others is certainly a common emotional response to a problem. And you picked up that very well with your question. You and I and anyone has some ability to change their own reactivity, her own reactivity to the relationships. And one way of changing anxiety, fearfulness, and stress reactions, one way of changing is to know more facts about those people whose lives shaped our own. One can also get scientific about it, and the science is fascinating. The Bowen Center is having a conference this weekend, bringing 6 scientists whose work looks at the ways that multi-generational history affects reproduction for an adult in their lifetime. And I think one can get scientific about oneself and one's own suffering in a way that modifies the reactivity too. Does that address, what else did you have in mind?
Well, it just makes me think that there's hope. It's not easy because forces are pretty strong coming from just a natural way of things being, like the order of things. But there is hope for oneself if one is willing to, as you say, take a look at things, become factual, and then make some decisions, I wonder.
Dr. Martinez, I don't think hope is necessary if someone can be factual, if someone can step back and be more factual, observant, curious and interested in their symptom, their circumstance. The evidence for change and flexibility is simply there.
Okay, give us an example. Give us a case, as the last part of this conversation, a case that can illustrate these different ideas that you have been talking about.
I'm thinking of a woman who had endometriosis recurring, pardon me, and was part of a family that was stressed and stressful. Her mother had developed early onset of arthritis symptoms. Her father was having affairs. He was in a stressful industry in Texas. And she had married and was at 40, late in life, so she had the age factor present. And she was interested in overcoming endometriosis, fatigue, pain, and in conceiving. And she was a highly motivated person. And she did several things to modify the tension, the physiological reactions that she carried. She got to know her family history on her mother's side, her mother's sister. She got to know her father and his history better. She began to relate to her parents in terms of how important they were to each other and how important it was for the family for them to straighten things out between them. She modified the way she saw her brother as being more fortunate than she. She used a growing sense of her own capability and maturity to deal with some of the challenges in her marriage and her husband's children from previous marriages as she began to use the coaching in family system psychotherapy to address some of the relationship stresses that were a part of her life. She also was using Pilates, nutritional supplements, and a nutritional program to maintain health, and yoga and meditation and some spiritual exercises.
A combo.
All of what made sense to her, she was bringing to bear on her situation and symptoms, the symptoms she had been experiencing for some time. She's done a series of videotaped interviews as part of the clinical conference series, and will talk about the changes that she noticed in her own health and energy, but that her OB-GYNs also began to report in her pelvic health and endometriosis, which began to resolve and did not recur as a product of interrupting and modifying the reactivity that would provoke the development of such symptoms. That's one example of it.
Right. Well, it speaks to the level of motivation and of hard work that this needs, but the importance of going that route if one really wants to make changes that last and not just...
Oh, you know, I think that the results were, I think two things. One, that chronic symptoms and symptoms that impact reproduction have been around a while. And the work of this kind of process of change is so much easier, more interesting than considering the alternative, which may be multiple surgeries, continued symptoms and pain. I think most people who work with me say, ah, piece of cake, considering what I've lived with and dealt with.
Wow.
This is, kind of gets to be fun.
Mm-hmm.
It does have to be, it does take persistence over time, but it's easier than often the alternatives.
One enjoys the ride. Victoria, do you want to say something about the Bowen Center as a place where people can hear more about these ideas that sort of are the foundation of what you described today?
I do think it's this approach to psychotherapy and to using self-regulation with biofeedback is fairly unusual, and the Bowen Center for the Study of the Family offers clinical services that people can use. They can contact the Bowen Center for a therapist who is trained in this approach and can work with them. I'm very interested in training other professionals. I'm very interested in what people can do in the mental health field, in nursing and medicine, to learn and use Bowen Theory within their practice to bring the resources to bear for people they're seeing with reproductive symptoms. It can make such a difference.
Well, there's the invitation.
So it's available.
There's the invitation. Thank you so much, and thank you for being again in Family Matters, Ms. Harrison. And I'd like to remind you that the Bowen Center for the Study of the Family offers the community affordable psychotherapy in both English and Spanish. If you would like more information about our topic or the services at the Bowen Center, please visit the website at www.thebowencenter.org or call 202-965-4400. Thank you for watching, and I invite you to join me again for another edition of Family Matters. I'm Dr. Mariana Martinez, and your family does matter.